All right, hey clinical psych people. So today I'm going to go over material for the client-centered or humanistic section. So I have a PowerPoint we'll just refer to, and then we'll go over the case study, and then I will direct you to what you need to know in terms of which videos to watch. So we will start with the PowerPoint. I'm going to share my screen here so you all can see what I am seeing. Alrighty. Okay, so you can see my desktop now. I'm going to go ahead and open up the PowerPoint here. So this is actually for a different book I've used in the past. I just think it's a nicer summary than the PowerPoint that goes with your book chapter. So we're going to talk a little bit about, again, the basics of client-centered or humanistic psychology, and then we'll go from there. So Carl Rogers really is the founder here. As you can see, he lived from 1902 to 1987, and he had a PhD in clinical psych. And he was the founder of Psychotherapy Research, which is really interesting because a lot of people now would argue that humanistic, it's really hard to do research on, but he genuinely wanted to see some of this succeed. And as you can see, some of the terminology changed, but he also applied his system to many different things. It'd be great to have Rogers around right now, probably. So within this theory, your basic motivating force is what's called actualization. So the idea is that we are born trying to be the best people we can be. And the values that we have are what get us there. So interestingly, Rogers thought of self-actualizing as a verb. It was something we're always doing. Some of the people that came after him, like Maslow, thought it was a place you arrive to, a noun. Rogers thought that we create our own subjective world, and we acquire what he called conditions of worth throughout our childhood. This is when, even unintentionally, people will sort of give us the indication, like, I only love you if you do X, you are Y, you get good grades, etc., etc. So he talked about in therapy the need for what he called unconditional positive regard, that regardless of what the client was doing, you wanted to support them. And so he thought that these conditions of worth were really what caused any kind of psychopathology. And he talked about incongruence being a major problem here between your own self-concept and what you experience in the world. And so he talked about defenses coming into play. Pretty much all of the therapists we'll talk about in this next section, till we get to some of like the third wave stuff, we're trained as psychoanalysts because it was the only way to be a therapist at that point in time. So some of this comes out of those ideas. So in terms of the therapeutic relationship, you need this positive regard. Rogers talked a lot about needing to be genuine in session. He called this congruence. You had to just be honest and open with your client and about how you were feeling. And then accurate empathy, to give the person empathy, but not just be like, it'll be okay, right? Just like sometimes like, yeah, that sucks and there's not much you can do about it, right? So your goal in therapy is to increase congruence, and the therapists control the process of therapy, but not the content. And in fact, probably more so than any type of therapy we'll talk about, the therapist does not control the content. Essentially, a lot of this is reflection and mirroring back to the person and trying to help the person find their own way. So you might talk about responsibility, self-esteem, you might talk about interpersonal conflicts, so some of the same stuff we talked about with IPT, right? Although this predates IPT. Talk about adjustment, talk about impulse control problems, and then you might get to ideas like the meaning of life, or how do you become an ideal individual. Um, in person-centered therapy, it's rare that you're going to do assessment. Essentially, you do an interview and go from there. Um, and you don't want to do this briefly. Like traditional psychoanalysis, this would be a long process. So typically once a week for multiple months. So I mentioned, I think during our IPT, maybe during another discussion about motivational interviewing, this actually came out of person-centered or client-centered therapies. And this is a type of therapy that founded on how we help people change, in particular, health behaviors like cigarette smoking, problem drinkers, as you see here. This has a lot of research behind it. And here are the 4 principles. You want to have empathy, just like in client-centered therapy, develop discrepancy, roll with resistance. The person is going to be resistant, otherwise you wouldn't have to do motivational interviewing, right? But you also want to support their self-efficacy and helping them realize they can do this. The skills, use the acronym ORS, scoot myself out of the way there for y'all. So open questions, affirmation, reflective listening, and summaries. So you want to ask open-ended, not yes/no questions. You want to seek affirmation that you're sort of like on the right page, and also affirm with them that this is hard, right? And that you're supporting them. You want to listen to what are their difficulties, what are their feelings, and you want to help them summarize what you talked about. Some information about the research. Basically, a lot of people argue that essentially person-centered or client-centered therapy is like the basics of what we do in any other kind of therapy, and then other therapies build on that. In terms of motivational interviewing, lots of research to support this, but for longer term things, you might need to combine it with something else. In terms of future directions, this is less popular, but again, has been integrated in different ways, and motivational interviewing is a big thing. Here are some of the key terms, not expecting y'all to memorize these or anything like that. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and open the case study worksheet for you all. So this is the case of David, and he's a 28-year-old male. I love that I have probably white hair. That must mean his race is not determined, but usually if we don't say race, we just assume they're white. That's unfortunately how it often is in our society. He was presenting with hearing voices, and he was disfluent. In terms of his personal and family mental health history, he had been in a mental health facility in Hawaii. He hears voices and recognizes they're disruptive. That doesn't always happen with people who hear voices. The voices will wake him up. The therapist didn't want to label him as schizophrenic. This is a very client-centered thing to try to like avoid labels or diagnoses, but the family used that label, so it's meaningful to the family. As you can see, he's been hospitalized 30 times. This is unfortunately not uncommon for people with severe mental illness. In terms of social history, this is a very creative person. He writes poetry and paints. He writes in English and Spanish. He was living with his parents in Chicago, and he was lonely. In terms of what they did a year of client-centered therapy, and the therapist was client-centered. There was a non-directive approach, which allowed him to speak freely. There were empathetic responses to whatever he said. And again, trying to avoid diagnosing or labeling him. Again, unique to this perspective, I think. The client tried to work with his disability to come up with like a sleep schedule and organization for how can I manage this illness. He was assertive in trying to understand when the voices started. The voices didn't compromise his ability to argue. So the therapist sort of describes it as like he's still in there. In terms of assessment and understanding of his voices, that was reasonable and clear. He's fully capable of explaining his experience. Again, not the case for everyone with schizophrenia. He was good at writing. He was aware of what was going on. He tried to live his life and work with it. In terms of difficulty, He had trouble talking, so it could be hard for his therapist to follow him. This is very common with schizophrenia, that you have some sort of disorganized speech patterns. The therapist would have to interrupt and distract him at times. And sometimes the therapist took what he was saying too personally. There's an example of that embedded within the case study. In terms of the treatment, and I've filled this out with another class so you all can make your own assessment, but essentially they thought it wasn't very effective. After a year of therapy, he had to be sent to a safe haven in Hawaii, and then he had more future help from a social worker. So again, here might be a case where you've got a guy who just maybe might not be as helpful. So I'm going to stop my share real quick, just while I pull up Blackboard for you all, so that I can see, direct you to where I want you to go in terms of the videos. Alrighty, so I'm going to come back in and share my screen again so you can see this. Alrighty, here we go. So we're on Blackboard. We're under videos and links. Okay, and then we're going to go on down to person-centered therapies. Again, humanistic, person-centered, client-centered, all terms that mean the same thing, essentially. So what I want you to watch here for sure are the Carl Rogers and Gloria counseling videos. And I think once you're on YouTube with these, it'll just sort of autoplay the next one, but if not, I have them all in sequence here. So this is actually from, and as you can see, there are 5 parts here. This is actually from a series of videos that they did with the same client, Gloria. And they also had an existential therapist and a rational emotive therapist work with the same client. So we're going to watch those as well throughout the semester. So this session is this video series is uncreatively called 3 Therapies, but it's really, really helpful, I think, to see the same clinicians work with the same client, or different clinicians work with the same client. And they also give a little intro beforehand, and then they do a little discussion of how they think the session went afterwards, which is kind of nice. So make sure you watch those. Again, it's 5 videos. I think it ends up being around 45 minutes or so altogether. We would traditionally do this in class, but watch them on your own time. There are a couple other videos on here. There's one particularly on motivational interviewing that might be really helpful to you, but the ones I for sure want you to watch are the Rogers and Gloria ones. Later in the semester, after we've watched all 3, you'll actually have a reaction assignment for that. So I just, again, really want to thank you all for hanging in there with me and going on this new adventure together. And please email me with any questions. Again, use my calendar link to set up a Google Meet. And I hope to see you all, or as many of you who can make it, and our Zoom meeting on Thursday, and I will actually get the date right this time, Thursday the 26th at 9:30 a.m. All right, guys, take care. Email me with any questions.